Good afternoon. Chapter 3, Lecture C. We're going to finish up Chapter 3 here. We're going to focus in on um, finishing up the growth of colonial America. Indian life and transition, the introduction of European and European materials and ways, alcohol. Obviously, alcohol is going to have a huge effect on anybody, but are going to have a massive impact on those the Indian population. Wipe out tribes and people from diseases, materials, and the tribes fighting each other. Slowly going to give way to new settlements on the frontier. They are going to continue to be pushed west and west. Uh, Unfortunately, this is going to destroy much of their culture. Regional diversity, the back country. So the Indians is pushed further west. A backcountry developed with small farms by labor on the frontier. Small farmers are going to make a unique lifestyle out there. The area stretching from central Pennsylvania southward through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia into upland, northland, and south country. Very rural at this time. This is where a lot of people are not living. It's very wild and remote. The older portions of the middle colonies of New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania were more oriented to commerce, where the backcountry or the further from the coast was much more rural. So you're going to have a lot different um, atmosphere in those two areas, though they're not that far apart. The growth of colonial America for the Consumer Revolution. During the 18th century, Great Britain eclipsed the Dutch as the leading producer and trader of inexpensive consumer goods. Local papers were filled with advertisements for British goods. Not modern consumerism, but you're going to see the growth in the appetite for those um, in the colonies wanting British goods. The British are going to hook them, and it's going to help grow the British economy. Colonial cities and 1700 cities were quite small compared to Spanish America and Europe. They were small. Expansion of trade encouraged the rise of port cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Philadelphia will really become the capital of the New World in this initial phase. The Atlantic world, people, ideas, and goods flow back and forth across the Atlantic. Complex trade network, there's going to be a lot of intertwined movements of things. Membership in the empire had many advantages for the colonies. So the colonies, though we obviously fast forward to later on, they benefited from being part of the British Empire. Most Americans did not complain about the regulation of trade because commerce enriched the colonies as well as the mother countries, so the colonies are going to prosper greatly from this. Lax enforcement of the navigation allowed for smuggling and flourishing of those individuals. Thus, the smuggling trade will be very extensive. Royal Navy protected shipping, and they would arrest smugglers from time to time, but they were more worried about protecting shipping in general. And so you're going to develop for several years, several decades, a very effective relationship between the British and the colonies. Social life in the colonies, the colonial elite most benefited from the economic growth. As colonial society matured, you have an elite group that will emerge, dominate politics and society. Chesapeake and Lower South were dominated by plantation staple crops. America had no titled autocracy, or autocracy. Family connections, cousinocracy is more appropriate term. Richest group was in South Carolina planters. So you're going to have a elite group that will start to emerge with a lot of low class backcountry types, people that are not super rich. But the point of this, though, is they're going to try to model themselves after the British model. So the elites are going to want the entitlements and the titles and all this. Anglicization. So social classes in the colonies, too. Anglicization became more and more English through trade and communications with the English in England. Wealthy Americans tried to model their lives on the etiquette of the British and behavior, viewed society as a hierarchical society in which some men were endowed with greater talents than others. Both sides of the Atlantic, elites viewed work as something reserved for common folk and slaves, not the upper class. Freedom from labor was the mark of a gentleman. So those in the colonies, once they get a hand up on a society, they are going to want to remain in that mindset. And they're not going to want to go be commoners again. Poverty in the colonies, though not considered the part of society, slaves were bad, their lives were sucky. Grew in the cities as people were looking for work. Taking the colonies as a whole, half the wealth in mid-century was concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of the population. So you're going to look at a very, very uneven distribution of wealth in the colonies initially. The poor will rise in the cities as more and more people come, but the reality at the end of the day, the worst lives was reserved for the slaves. Social class is in the colonies, the middle ranks. Large majority of free Americans lived between the extremes of wealth and poverty, so they lived an okay life, kind of like today. What distinguished of mainland colonies from Europe was the wide distribution of land and the economic autonomy of most ordinary free families, meaning a lot of commoners or free people had land, which was not common back in the British Isles. Two-thirds of the free male population were farmers and owned their own land, unheard of back in England. So though they were commoners, maybe not as rich, they had the ability to own their own land and control their own destiny. Colonial farmers viewed land ownership almost as a right, the social precondition of freedom. So if you owned land, you were free, essentially, is what they believed. Women in the household economy, families were the center of economic life. Uh, More marriages became lifetime commitments. Free women were expected to devote their lives to being good wives and mothers. Women's rights actually receded some as we go closer and move forward in time here. Rise in domestic chores. Women are going to be expected to take care of the house while the male or the father is going to be the worker. Social class in the colonies. North America mid-century. By mid-18th century, the area that would become the United States was home to a remarkable diversity of peoples and different kinds of social organization. More freedoms existed in the colonies than in Europe at the time, and many still found themselves confined to the partial freedom that they had known, whether it be indentured serfhood or they were just back in the hierarchical status. The point of this, as we draw here, getting into later on in the British colonies' rise, is you're going to start to see that the New World is much more, what the word I'm looking for, opportunistic, and challenges are going to be made to the old status quo. The biggest thing is when people get the right to vote later on, the biggest requirement in England was owning land, and half the population is going to own land in the colonies, which is going to completely make a unique and different element that had not been encountered before in the colonies. That concludes this lesson.